Around 2019 to 2020, social media companies like Meta and Google, they have these reports that talk about compliance with state mandated directions to block content.
Yeah.
Pakistan was number one in the world for sending takedown requests to Meta platforms in that period. Number one in the world, not South Asia,
Wow.
globally.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of Legally Speaking. I'm your host, Oves Anver. Now, as Pakistanis, we're certainly no strangers to curbs on our freedom of expression. Historically, the law has been weaponized to silence critics, journalists, and political opponents. In a recent report by the European Union, limitations on freedom of expression were deemed to be serious and persistent. My guest today has written a detailed article on how the law has been used, or misused rather, in Pakistan, looking at the historical roots of this type of suppression and linking them with laws prevalent today, such as PECA and various others. I'm delighted to have with me Hassan Abdullah Niazi, who is an advocate of the High Court and a member of the visiting faculty at both LUMS and Kinnaird College for Women. Hassan, welcome to the show.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Wonderful. Hassan, you mentioned in your exceptional article, paint a bit of a bleak picture, if you will, that repression is part of our DNA. I think I'm paraphrasing here, but that's roughly what you say.
Mm.
That it is something that we inherited from the British. It was part of the entire legal framework, and that we were very happy maintaining that type of repressive framework. Could you explain that to our viewers as well? That what do you really mean by it's part of our DNA and that we've inherited it in such a way.
Well, I think if you go back to the British colonial empire, the British colonial empire built up a structure of the rule of law that was very different in the colonies than it was in the metropole.
Yeah.
So, what essentially happened was this the way they looked at protests, the way they looked at dissent, was very cautiously as a dangerous commodity. Now they would perfect the repressive mechanisms for quashing dissent in places like Ireland. So Ireland was one of the places where a lot of these practices and laws that I describe in the article start to come up and start to be perfected. And Pakistan is no different. So I let me tell you, an Irish lawyer once described their own legal system as saying that if you look at our statute books, it's a melancholy record of Arms Act, Insurrection Acts, acts to suspend the habeas corpus, acts to suppress dissent, as if the only thing that we are to be proud of is how to crush the spirit of the nation. And that is also true for Pakistan. What happened was the British created the penal code, keeping in mind an imperative of control. How do we control the native population? And they viewed dissent and the speech of Indians or even the press in India with a lot of disdain. Like John Stuart Mill, who is seen as this champion of freedom of expression, had very low views about the press in India. You know, historically saying that, not even one book in India could, not even an entire library in India could hold up to one book of the British, famously saying. So it's a combination of two things. One is a disdain for the indigenous population and what they have to say. The second, because it's an insecure regime. It's a regime built upon violence and legitimacy drawn from violence, that it is very circumspect about native uprisings and dissent. So it comes up with laws, and there's a vast variety of laws. These laws are open ended, they are often vague, and they give a lot of discretion to executive functionaries to determine what speech is allowed and what is not. And there's a whole host of them. It goes all the way back to the 1910 Press Act, where they started to see that there was a local press growing and they wanted to control it. So they made a very vague law that could censor a whole host of expressions. It goes to the offense of sedition, which is 124A of the Penal Code, and which still exists in Pakistan today, barring Punjab, where it was struck down. It even exists in India today and in a lot of colonies. And sedition was essentially, if I was to really summarize it,
Mhm.
it was the offense of inciting bad feelings against the government, as if affection for the government could be created through force. And the entire point of sedition was this: anything that went against what the government wanted could be a criminal offense. And many of the people who were tied to the independence movement in India and Pakistan would face the wrath of this. Gandhi called it the prince amongst the political sections of the penal code.
Right.
And many scholars have called it this masterpiece of uncertainty. I think once we gained independence, we created and tried to create liberal constitutional frameworks. But what did not change is these codified laws in our statutes, our reliance on past judgments from the colonial period that upheld these provisions and
Mhm.
justified these provisions, and also the mindset of our executive agencies like the bureaucracy, the police, the military, in which they still saw speech as this dangerous commodity. We never changed these provisions of the penal code. We never changed provisions of the criminal procedure code. And we continue to rely on a lot of these precedents. And this thinking about speech, in which anything that we see as dangerous to public order, this word public order, it was given such a broad meaning in the colonial empire that it can encompass anything. And so we have these laws, not just sedition, we still have criminal defamation, we still have offenses that talk about public mischief, we have offenses regarding creating enmity, and a whole host of others that we'll discuss.
Yeah.
And I think our inability to move away from that has a lot to do with the fact that we have gone through successive periods of authoritarian control, military dictatorships. And these provisions are ideal for those sort of setups. If you are in power, you do not want to give up any of this. Now, that is not to say we haven't made any progress, but that's why I say we look at the current regime and we say it's a very bad time for freedom of expression. But if this regime goes, we used to say the same about the previous regime,
Mhm.
right? That's a bad time for freedom of expression. The point is, whoever comes in power does not do away with the structural problem we are facing, in which the Constitution may guarantee so many things, but the practice of the executive, the practices in our criminal courts, the practices of our police, our military are completely traveling in an alternative dimension, I would say, from what the Constitution is trying to say. So I
Definitely.
think that's the historical context that I'm trying to bring, that we cannot fail to see there is a structural problem in the fact that we have gained independence. But for the dissenting voice, I don't think the colonial powers ever went away.
Hassan, on that point, you make a very, compelling argument there. What replaced the Gora? Like, was it the elite in Pakistan? Was it, um, uh, one is what replaced the elite and the
Right.
controlling entity. That's one thing. And the second is, how did we inherit the same disdain that the British had or the Gora man had for the brown man, being a
Right.
brown ourselves, right? I mean, how did
Yeah.
we? Because essentially, what we're talking about is that same level of racism we were very happy to maintain, right? And there was actually
Yes.
an obligation on us to have changed that for our own betterment. Do we not think ourselves worthy enough? Um, do you think that it is a class issue or a socioeconomic issue that is really behind ensuring the perpetuity of these types of laws?
Well, there's a lot of like different layers in that question, and I don't want to downplay like how complex that topic becomes, because we could end up talking about
Just this.
post independence, the problems that Pakistan faced, in the sense that there was a vacuum, right? There was a big vacuum in terms of leadership in the state,
Hmm.
and someone had to come in and fill that vacuum. And if you read like texts like, let's say, Aisha Jalal and so on, who talk about how the bureaucracy and the military stepped into that vacuum and thus started to centralize a lot of power. But I think a lot of it is also our inability to really be a proper democracy, right? And I think failing that, where we look at it from that angle, where we have had successive periods of martial law and military rule, those were always going to supplement these provisions. And the judiciary at that time was always going to protect a lot of these provisions because they were seen as so necessary to maintain order. The other thing I will say, though, is also um, we have nurtured a concept of being a very insecure state,
Okay.
as opposed to a security state, right? I think there's a lot of insecurity that is within that state. Some of it may be justified
Mhm.
given, neighboring boundaries, territorial disputes, and so on and so forth. But I really believe that a nation that is fundamentally afraid all the time is far more likely to give up a lot of fundamental rights in the name of feeling secure.
Yeah.
And this is something that the American founders, actually, if you read the Federalist Papers,
Mhm.
they actually are talking about this. They talk about how they need to create the US needs to eventually become sort of an island like Britain, like Great Britain, because if they become an island, they do not have to worry about borders in the same way, and thus they will not have this feeling of fear and insecurity all the time in the population. And then there is a lot, as you said, there is a lot about elite control and control by unelected institutions like the military in our past.
Yeah.
And I think the failure of democracy in Pakistan has completely failed to actually create a space where even dialogue on these things can actually genuinely happen. I think a lot of these offenses and provisions are used to be used in the peripheries, right? They used to be used in places like the frontier crime regulation, quite
Yeah.
well, as what that was. And it was there for such a long time because it was so far away
Mhm.
from the population. And so many other things, that were happening in Balochistan or parts of KP that were isolated. And I think if you look at like post-colonial jurisprudence, like Amos Cesar and so on, who talk about how what you do in the peripheries will eventually come. It will eventually come back to the center. And what we are confronting today is all of that now being used in a Punjab, a Sindh, in big cities. Uh, and I think that's also why the outrage has gotten a lot more. So, I mean, I think it's a very complex set of facts about why post colonies ended up with these sort of systems. But it's not only Pakistan, right? India grapples with the same problem, even though it was a genuine democracy, even though it did not have the same sort of issues that Pakistan had. But sedition is still an offense there. 144 is still an offense there. So I think there's a lot of complexity that goes into political capital and how much you're willing to change, how much power you are willing to give up.
Absolutely, absolutely. No, I
Yeah.
think make a lot of sense there. Um, I think part of it, has definitely been the vacuum in that was there after independence, but also the lack of, the democratic deficit that we've been suffering for so
Yeah.
long, and our perhaps lack of ability to mature a democracy that is truly representative. I
Yes.
think that also plays into it. But you're right again, because we see time and again, even the new laws that are being developed, that arbitrariness, discretion, vague terminology is just part and parcel of how we develop new laws.
Yes.
Yeah, so I think that's it. And I think one particularly egregious example of this is, and you mentioned this in your article, is PECA, right? Where
Yes.
where sedition left off, PECA starts from there
Yeah.
and really builds onto that. So could you help us better understand how PECA is used as a tool again to further this notion of oppression, but also this enhanced state powers to deal with a dissent like that?
So PECA, as a law came into being in 2016. One of the things we just spoke about is how this concept that we are under threat, right? Which is why I say this insecure state mentality.
Yeah.
Um, it's a good example of how that's used. So, what happens is in 2014, APS Peshawar is attacked, and there's a terrorist attack there, and the National Action Plan is formulated. Your organization has done a lot of great work on looking at the past and anti-terrorism laws, and I think if you look at the National Action Plan, one of the things it talks about is we need to stop the recruitment, planning of terrorism, and proliferation of terrorist content online. So, using that, the state starts to say that we need a law on cybercrime, which by itself is pretty straightforward at that time. You needed something. But the law ends up not exactly being about terrorism, it ends up being about so many other things. But the justification again and again was that we need this to counter terrorism. The second justification was that we need this to protect women online. Now, when the law is passed, it actually has a whole host of provisions that are vague, that are very broadly worded, and crucially, it gives the power to block content online to the executive, and that is the Pakistan Telecommunication Authority. So, the power it has would eventually be that the PTA could ask for the blocking of any content online that was either an offense under PECA, and there was a whole host of them, including an offense which is Section 20, which is about offenses against the dignity of a natural person. If you read that offense, it's actually just another criminal defamation provision.
Okay.
And criminal defamation has been phased out across the world,
Yeah.
mostly because it's seen as a disproportionate restriction on free speech. So the PTA gets this power. There's really no check on that power. It's completely in their discretion to determine what is lawful and unlawful, not just under PECA, but also under the Pakistan Penal Code. So, all these offenses that I spoke about, sedition and so on, all these anti state offenses, they could ask for them to be blocked. And if someone did not comply, they could block entire platforms. We, as a country, have blocked at least once every major social media platform. Uh, at least once we have.
It's quite the
So,
badge of honor.
yes. And another thing I will tell you, Oves, if you look at the data, um, around 2019 to 2020, um, social media companies like Meta and Google, they have these reports that talk about compliance with state mandated directions to block content.
Yeah.
Pakistan was number one in the world for sending takedown requests to Meta platforms in that period. Number one in the world, not South Asia,
Wow.
globally. The question comes, we do not know anything about these requests because the PTA does not share any information. So
Mm.
there's a whole censorship apparatus operating behind closed doors in which members of the executive have the power to determine what speech is allowed online and what is not. And going just back to what we were discussing, you see, here is a big problem that draws all the way back from the British colonial empire. Because in the colonial empire, the executive and judiciary were more or less fused in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
You have your bureaucrats exercising judicial powers.
Magistrate.
Even today, like we still have that. And we never really did that separation properly. We did it at a level, which is the higher courts.
Mhm.
But, even today, if I want to do a protest, I have to go to the DC and ask him if I can do a protest.
Yeah.
Aurat March faces this every year, right?
Absolutely.
So that was one aspect of PECA. And then the second aspect was the investigating agency was the FIA.
Yeah.
And soon we saw that PECA started to be used not to go after terrorism, but to go after dissent. And we've seen this happen in every regime. It was brought in the PMLN regime. It would be used against the PMLN by the PTI. Today, it is being used against the PTI and journalists by the PMLN. Similarly, women, which it was supposed to protect, what happened was when Me Too started to gain momentum, a lot of women started to come out in Pakistan and talk about XYZ has harassed them and accusing people of sexual misconduct. So many of these women would be sent notices by the FIA under Section 20 that this is actually criminal defamation, and they were silenced. So PECA started to create this chilling effect, and this is documented by a lot of human rights organizations. In 2025, what happens is it's amended to create, I will say, two new things. One, now if you cast aspersions against state institutions, that could also be censored and blocked. So this is where I say it becomes very similar to sedition.
Yeah.
Now, under international human rights principles, Pakistan's own constitution, public officials, if they want any sort of criticism against them to be stopped, they have to meet a very high threshold. Because if you take that away, then you don't have a democratic system at all.
Yeah.
Um, this law actually makes it easier for them to get that speech blocked. And who decides who blocks that speech? It's people appointed by the federal government who serve at the pleasure of the federal government. It's not courts. The second offense it creates is this offense of spreading false information. They don't define what's false. They have no defenses for opinion, satire, jokes, any of this. Like our discussion right now could fall within the definition of the very broad definition of aspersion or spreading false information. And how it starts to be used is any criticism of the state that the state does not like is prosecuted under PECA.
Mm.
That is the world we live in right now. Last year, court ordered 27 YouTube channels owned by journalists to be suspended for spreading fake news.
Wow.
It would eventually be overturned, but that is the sort of way that PECA is being used today. And I do equate it with sedition because essentially the aim of this law is not to protect our cybersecurity. It's to protect the state from criticism, which is what sedition was for the offline space.
No, absolutely. I think you make a very valid point there. Um, Hassan, just look, a counter argument or playing the
Right.
devil's advocate here. We have, a serious misinformation or disinformation problem in
Yes.
Pakistan. Without effective legislation, we'd never be able to deal with it. Where do
Yeah.
we draw the line really between sedition on one end and misinformation and controlling misinformation or disinformation on the other end?
So I think it's a great question, right? So I'm not someone who says that there should be no law regarding misinformation because it is a problem,
Yeah.
right? And misinformation versus disinformation, deep fakes, all of these things, these are genuine online harms. The problem that I have seen is one, the law as it is currently framed does not even try to balance free speech with online harm, right?
Okay.
So there is a balance that can be achieved. For example, look at what the European Union has done with its disinformation codes, its new law on social media, in which it talks about obligations on social media companies to tackle misinformation and disinformation, and them having systems in place to counter these methods, to counter misinformation and disinformation. Now, what it does differently is it puts the onus on companies, it puts the onus on things like safety by design. That from the moment you create a product on social media, you must document and prove that you considered safety, uh, the problem of misinformation, disinformation from its very inception. And you put in reporting requirements. What are you doing to counter misinformation? What are you doing to counter disinformation? There are audits of social media companies. So, what I am trying to say is The problem is that our solution to everything is make it a criminal offense.
Yeah.
That is what I disagree with. And what happens is we don't just make it a criminal offense, we make it a broad, arbitrarily exercised criminal offense. You can look at the EU to find how they are trying to achieve a balance between free speech and the harm of misinformation. You could even look at other countries. You can look at Singapore, which has a law called POFMA. Now, it has its own problems. But one thing they do is whenever the government thinks that information online is false, it asks the social media companies to label it as such. So if you look at something, underneath that content, it will say, Facebook or Google is mandated by the government of Singapore to inform you that it deems this information to be false,
I see. Okay.
right? Right? So that is step one. Now, if it keeps escalating, eventually they can ask for it to be blocked. But you see the proportionality analysis that at least went into this.
Yeah. Yeah.
Our approach has no proportionality. It treats, for example, my father sending a WhatsApp forward to me the same way as a foreign disinformation intelligence op. Now, you and I know there is a difference here.
Yeah.
One is unintentional, the other is intentional. But even this distinction doesn't exist in our law. So it doesn't even define what is fake information. It doesn't even provide defenses.
Yeah.
Is an op-ed false information? Well, under PECA, it could be, but that's an opinion. How can an opinion be false? So there isn't a lot of thought that went into this. If
Mhm.
there was, we would be having a different conversation. And I think that's an important conversation to have. But this law was passed in 15 minutes
Yeah.
in Parliament. 15 minutes.
Wow.
None of what we are talking about was discussed. So, proportionality, which is a core element of fundamental rights, it's not even factored into this law.
Absolutely, Hassan. I think you know you've laid out pretty key areas, but I think one element is also how we develop legislation in Pakistan, and
Right,
it goes across
exactly.
the board. I was recently involved in the National Action Plan on human rights, and some of the legislation that we develop, there's such a little thought that goes into it.
Yes,
I remember, and you mentioned this also in your article, the Protection of Pakistan Act, and I remember that was
yes,
drafted in one day, let alone
yes,
negotiate or pass through Parliament. And and that carried the death penalty as one of its
yes.
things. It reversed the burden of proof and things like that. I mean,
And again, another example of lawmaking on the pretext of danger. We
yeah,
are afraid. That
absolutely.
was what Protection of Pakistan Act was. And what did it justify? It justified military trials. It justified reversing the burden of proof.
Yeah,
So that's the problem that we keep confronting. We cannot get out of this loop.
absolutely, absolutely. Um, Another really good point that you made in your article was that process as punishment. Really,
Yes,
that conviction is besides the point. The process itself, it is so there's so much attrition in it. It ruins people's lives. It causes so much that it becomes the deterrent itself. Right? You don't want to
yes,
be involved in anything related to PECA or something like that because it is. For a journalist or it's for anyone else, it is just such a hassle and such a problem. Um,
yes,
how do you feel? Do you think that that is a general thing in the Pakistani legal system where, 75% of people in prisons are under trial, where we've now just made it, the process is the punishment because we can't get convictions in this country?
yes. So I think definitely, I think the process is the punishment when it comes mostly to PECA, right? So the state may be able to say, for example, when GSP Plus comes around, that, oh, but there are no convictions, right? Um, the problem is going through our core process. As a lawyer, I, having seen it so much, as a litigation lawyer, having seen it so much, it is slow, it is costly, and it just does not work. Most of the time, it does not work. And any journalist, any beat reporter who has to go through that, the time and expense that is gone is never coming back.
Yeah,
Right? And
absolutely.
so the guarantee becomes silence, right? Because you also don't trust the system. If we trusted the system, if you
Mhm.
were like, you know what, I think I'll get justice. But nobody trusts the system. They only believe they'll maybe get some. Used to be that they used to believe that, okay, maybe if we go to the High Court or something, Supreme Court, we might get something. But now I feel, and this is the general feeling in the legal community right now, that after the 27th Amendment, even that avenue seems to a lot of people to be illusory, right? They don't see the point. So if that is the perception of your justice system, anyone caught in an FIR, it takes so long for it to go away.
Mhm.
And an FIR comes with consequences. I strongly disagree with a lot of, with respect, some of the opinions on this, that I've seen judges in court say in cases that it's just an FIR, it's not a conviction. But
Mhm.
that's not true in real life. It's not just an FIR, right? It's a sword that hangs over your head. If, let's say, you want to get a visa, like the world we live in, all of us Pakistanis, we need to get a visa for anywhere. It shows up as a criminal record. And
Absolutely.
even if you get acquitted, I have seen this myself, even if you get acquitted, it still shows up. And then you have to go to the high court, you have to get a direction, and then the police will remove it. So that is just a simple example. That's just a administrative example. But 3 4 years going to courts, having to appear in person, having to pay lawyers, having to pay some, oftentimes people in law enforcement, because there's such a culture of corruption there. It's enough to silence anyone. Frankly, it's enough to silence the best of them. Even if you get bail, even a short time in jail is gonna break a lot of people, right? And that's the sad reality.
Absolutely. We a year or two ago, the issue of surveillance had really come up because
Yeah,
Justice Babastar, and you mentioned this as well. He had basically said that the mechanism of surveillance that you have, this is unauthorized surveillance. It's not permitted under the law. You have, the only real legal cover that you had was the Investigation of Fair Trial Act, and you had to get a warrant under it. That wasn't done. That was a really interesting episode because what we saw was the government coming up with some legal cover for its thing, not acknowledging the fact that it is conducting
yeah.
unlawful surveillance, pretty much across the country. What is your take on how surveillance is conducted in Pakistan, and what limits need to be imposed on that?
So it's interesting, because we were just talking about how the first time we met was at a conference when the Investigation of Fair Trial Act had just come
Yeah,
in
absolutely.
2013 as the People's Party's government. And the Investigation of Fair Trial Act, as you rightly put it, said that wiretapping could be done if you got a warrant.
Mhm.
Now, the act has a pretty lengthy process for obtaining that warrant. You had to get it from a high court judge, and it was in camera, and there's a whole process behind it. Um, so we come to 2024. Justice Babar Sattar is hearing a case on audio leaks, unlawful surveillance, and he looks at the Investigation Fair Trial Act, and we find out that not a single warrant has ever been issued under the act since it came about.
Yeah,
But we all know that surveillance is still happening. So, that really is something to be studied a bit further about law and these extra legal procedures that also exist in Pakistan, where we don't know how it's authorized, but we have also normalized it. Right? So unlawful surveillance is one of them. Um, what is discovered is that the state mandates to all the telecom companies that they install a system called the Lawful Intercept Management System. This is a system that is sold by a company in Germany, was sold to the Pakistani government. It allows the intelligence agencies and the security apparatus to essentially monitor around 4 million people at a time.
Wow.
The PTA disclosed in court to the Islamabad High Court that telecom providers are under an obligation to ensure that up to 2% of their entire consumer base can be surveilled at any one point of time. We don't know how this 2% is figured out, what goes into it. But the telecom company said, we can't say no because if we say no, we can't operate. All of this was happening outside of the law. It would not have come forward unless Justice Babur Sattar had not been brave enough to do it. And this is why we need an independent judiciary. Um,
Absolutely.
so Justice Babur Sattar looks at LIMS, and LIMS essentially what it allows you to do is look at traffic data and mobile communications,
Mhm.
and it stores that data for authorities to later be able to go through. So Orwellian, yes, very much so, happening outside the law. And essentially, what happens after this is Justice Babur Sattar says this is all unconstitutional. What the government does is instead of confronting the fact that what it is doing is so sinister, it amends the Pakistan Telecom Act to authorize the ISI to be able to do this. And that is challenged. By the time that is challenged, the 26th Amendment has come, and soon the 27th will come. That challenge goes nowhere. It's just in limbo in Islamabad and Lahore. Meanwhile, Justice Babur Sattar's decision is suspended pending appeal by a constitutional bench. And LIMS operates even now. Amnesty International has put out a very comprehensive report on LIMS. But what is the effect of this? The effect of this is now that every journalist, every human rights actor, members of the opposition, everyone feels like they are being surveilled and everyone has a story. As I said in my article, journalists in Balochistan, KP, have said that, well, we feel like our phones are tapped. We feel like everything we say is going to get out. So we don't say anything. We
Mhm.
don't know what to do. And it cascades further because there's so many aspects to this. It's not just journalists in their private communication in which their sources could be compromised, their private audios could be leaked, as is what happened with many members of the judiciary, many members of the public and the opposition. But think of human rights actors. If a non-governmental organization is seen as doing something that the state does not like, well, the state has ample powers to cancel registration, audit funding, so on and so forth. Let's say DawnNews, Express Tribune, the News, any of these newspapers, they are heavily reliant on public advertising,
Yeah.
right, from the state. That can be pulled at any moment. And so you are influencing editorial policy, you are influencing speech by making people believe that once they step across an ever changing line, an ever changing red line, there will be consequences.
Mhm.
And so that's how you chill speech. Surveillance essentially chills speech. It makes people believe that they are being watched, even if they are not. And so, like Jeremy Bentham, the philosopher, had this concept of the panopticon, right? It
Absolutely.
was the
Yeah.
ideal prison. And it was the ideal prison because every prisoner believed they were being watched at all times, even if that was not true. So they would all try to be on their best behavior. That's what these surveillance systems create.
And I think another part of the panopticon was that it was an additional form of punishment that you lost your
Yes.
privacy, right? Which is
Yes.
basically the same that is happening in through limbs that we are being punished for really no fault of our own, in a
And
sense.
the problem is we are limbs and the system used to censor content, which is the web management system that the PTA has. All of these have been procured with public money. It's taxpayers' money. And it's been hidden from the taxpayer, it's been hidden from the public until, judicial decisions allowed them to come forward. And the sad part is, it is the public that is constantly punished for questioning these models.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Um, you know, I recognize that, you're a busy man, but I just wanted to end by asking you. You mentioned that the fix to this is long, painful, and we're going to have to be
Yeah.
very patient about it. What what do what really is the fix? Is this a cultural issue? Is this something that we need to go a lot deeper in, um, and start fixing the way, or the government needs to, or maybe not even the government, but behavioral change at a national level is really what we're asking. Is that what you're referring to? Is there something that we can do which is specific to the government, that the state needs to take specific steps that can protect us in a way?
I think it's not any one thing that needs to be done. It will be a very multifaceted thing that needs to be done. Like, look, for example, um, we would need to re-examine the Criminal Procedure Code, the Pakistan Penal Code, and so on, uh, as well as a host of other laws that we have.
Yeah.
And we need to look at everything from a democratic and fundamental rights perspective. Um, so, for example, if we go into a reform agenda, we would be reforming a whole host of laws, like most of the national security laws we have in place. Look at the Anti-Terrorism Act.
Yeah, absolutely.
But along with the redefining a lot of these laws, there is a cultural shift that has to happen. And that cultural shift would involve reforms in the bureaucracy, reforms in our criminal justice system, where executive and judicial independence is guaranteed. You need an independent judiciary, you need a proper system of democracy. So there's no one fix here, right? And that's why I say it's long and painful, because we will have to take painful decisions. We will have to people would have to expend a lot of political capital. And well, there needs to be a lot less influence from certain institutions that has played a long role in our country's history. I wish I could say that, we fix this law and this problem will be solved, because it's not just a legal problem, right? There is also a mindset problem we have. So I'll give you an example. When TikTok sort of took off in Pakistan and we banned it, I think, 2 or 3 times, I always felt there was an underlying bias in that decision, in which people looked at it as something that was crude and maybe not so valuable speech, as you may call it, because the masses were using it.
Yeah,
We still have that disdain for that voice, I think, and that's a cultural issue, right?
absolutely.
That's a socioeconomic issue. And so there's no one solution. I think we could, as a starting point, um, have a proper democracy, have an independent judiciary again. And most importantly, I think we need to look at very carefully our legislation, which still has so many remnants of a colonial playbook in it, because those laws were not made for the benefit of the people, they were made for the benefit of the state. So
Mhm.
we need to start flipping that over. And look, it can be done. The question is, like, we keep pressing this point and we make sure that we keep raising our voice for these problems.
Absolutely. Hassan, thank you so much for joining me. That was really helpful.
It was my pleasure. Thank you for having me.